Welcome to the GTAP Tech Talk webinar on Security Center 5.1 Failover Directory Configuration. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Derek Schaefer. I am an e-content specialist with Genetec. I'll be presenting the webinar for you today, and I'd also like to introduce the other members of the GTAP webinar team that will be taking part in the presentation. First of all, we've got Michael Carr, who is one of our technical support engineers with the Genetec Technical Assistance Center. He'll be answering any questions you have during the webinar, and we'll bring him in at the end of the webinar to answer a few of the common questions live on the air with us. We've also got Parvez Alam with us to help with questions as well. Parvez is the team leader of the Special Projects team, and many of you may not know this, but he's been working behind the scenes on the GTAP Tech Talk webinar since the very beginning. So if you have any questions on the material we're going over, you can just type them in the question box of the GoToWebinar console, and someone will get back to you with an answer shortly. If we get a lot of questions on one subject or have a really good question that's good for everyone to know, we'll save it for the end of the webinar and ask Mike for the answer. Any questions that we cannot answer in the time we have today will be recorded, and we'll be sure to send you an email with your answer. All the questions and answers from today's session will be cleaned up and posted on the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal forums under the GTAP Tech Talk section. If you have any additional comments or questions on the webinar or the GTAP Tech Talk webinar series in general, you can post those in this section of the forum as well. If you've missed any previous webinars, you're in luck because we've recorded them all and put them on the GTAP. You can find them by going to the Tools section and then going to Videos and clicking on the GTAP Tech Talk section here. There are two ways that you can watch these, either streaming in a browser window by clicking on this icon here, or you can download a zipped Windows media file by clicking on this second icon right here. If you want to be kept up to date on the latest additions to the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal, you can log into the GTAP, go to the My Account section, and click on Email and Notifications. From the Notifications section down here, you can check the boxes of the subjects you're interested in and select how often you'd like to be alerted when there have been additions to these subjects. In order to put a checkbox next to a subject, the frequency will have to be set to daily or weekly. If you have it set to never, the options below it will be grayed out. You can also edit your subscription to our two Genetec newsletters in the email sections up here. And don't forget to hit the submit button on the bottom to save your changes. Moving on to the agenda for today's webinar, the first topic we'll have a look at is the failover directory legacy, specifically the changes between Omnicast and Security Center. After that, we'll take a look at the system concept, including how directory load balancing works and the new database failover feature and its two options, backup and restore, and mirroring. We'll go into the configuration of the options after that, starting with the licensing requirements and how to apply the license, and then moving on to the configuration of the load balancing options. As part of the database configuration, we'll need to look at setting up remote connections. And then our two database failover options, backup or restore, and mirroring. We've got some best practices that are recommended for setting up a directory failover system, and some troubleshooting steps as well. Now, in previous webinars, we've done a frequently asked questions section, but we thought we'd try something new this time. So this is the point in the webinar where I'll bring Mike in, and we'll go over some of the common questions from the webinar and get the answers straight from the pro. So starting off, I want to take a look at our legacy, how we used to do failover in Omnicast, and how it compares to Security Center. If you're familiar with how Omnicast does failover, you'll notice there are quite a few differences with the new system and the new procedures to follow when setting it up. We'll take a look at a few of these differences now, starting with licensing, and then we'll look at the configuration differences, moving on to how the client connections are handled, and finally how the databases are handled. So, taking a look at the licensing first, the first thing to notice is the actual parts that are required. In an Omnicast system, we need one license for the primary directory server and one additional license for each failover server. If you take a look on the GTAP, you'll notice something like this for a system with a very basic directory failover system using one failover server. On the new Security Center side, the primary directory is handling all the licensing for all the failover directory machines, so in the GTAP we would only see the one directory license for the system. Part of the licensing involves how the servers are installed. In Omnicast, when we install the primary directory, we need to specify that we're using directory failover and that the machine is the primary server. The failover servers would need to be installed as directory servers as well, but we choose to install them as backup servers when prompted. Now on the installation side for Security Center, we don't need to add a failover component to the installation, and all the failover servers are installed as expansion servers. We don't need a license for these, as the primary directory will take care of all that. If we look at the license parts from the server admin, in Omnicast we need one standby directory part for each server, including the primary machine. Security Center handles things a little differently, and will only need parts for the additional directory servers, and not one for the primary directory. So if you take a look at both these parts listed here, they're both applicable for a failover directory system running with 2 servers in total. Moving on to the next section on configuration, there are a few major differences in how the system functions and how the servers are used. In Omnicast, the directory failover functions are being handled by the Directory Failover Coordinator service, or DFC. There's a DFC service running on each server that will be used as a failover directory. In Security Center, we don't use services anymore, so everything will be handled by one role. The new role being used is the Directory Manager. Now when setting up your system, in Omnicast we had to configure everything using the Directory Failover Coordinator wizard, which sent the connection information to all the servers in the system. Our new Directory Manager role in Security Center handles most of the configuration, as we'll see later on, with a change or two needed in the server admin, but otherwise everything is done through the config tool. One of the key differences in how the system operates is how the additional servers are used. An Omnicast system running with directory failover will only have one directory running at a time. The directory failover coordinators on the servers will communicate with each other to see when they need to start their directory services, which will normally remain stopped until needed. On the Security Center side of things, once you've set up an expansion server to be included as part of the directory failover system, it will be running as a directory all the time. This will be used to help distribute the client connections among the servers. Now in Omnicast we had the concept of global and local failover directories, where you had remote sites that could disconnect and run on their own. This has changed a bit in Security Center, as everything is running on one level and the directories are all active and working together. Alright, moving on to the client connections, there are a few differences in general as well related to failover. The Omnicast Gateway service was used to handle how the clients connected to the system, and pretty much everything went through one gateway unless it was deliberately specified. In Security Center, we aren't using the gateway anymore, with part of the responsibility going to the media router role, and the client connections going directly through the directory. Since we have all directories running, the clients are distributed over the multiple directories in order to spread the load out over the whole system. Related to this, in Omnicast we saw the use of multiple gateways, but you still had to connect through the main directory, such as a reverse gateway. You'll get the same functionality in Security Center, where clients can connect to a local server, but they will be connecting to a local directory. This means that they won't have connection issues if the main directory goes down, since they still have a local directory to connect to. We can force this directory connection from the options in the client applications. Now, one of the big changes in Security Center is how the databases fail over. In Omnicast, we had one database in use for the primary server, and the other databases for each failover server. The information from the main database was copied over to the databases on the backup server. Security Center has two methods of keeping the databases up to date, either using backup and restore, or using SQL mirroring. We'll take a look at the differences of the two in a few minutes. Now, one similarity between the two is that if you made any changes while on the backup database, those changes will be lost when the primary comes back online, unless the backup database is manually copied over to the primary. Using SQL mirroring in Security Center will help, where the changes to one database are maintained on the other. The only drawback is a stability problem if the databases lose connection with each other, so both the backup and restore mirroring methods have their pros and cons. Now, one last thing to mention is that in Omnicast, the database is linked to a directory, so if we lose the main directory, it will switch over to the backup directory and database. In Security Center, the directory and database failover procedures are independent of each other, so one does not affect the other. Let's take a look at a simple example here and see how the same system would be handled in both Omnicast and Security Center. On the Omnicast side, we have our 2 servers and 2 databases. The second one here is our failover directory. As we mentioned, each directory points to one database, either locally or on the network. We've also got a couple of clients who want to connect and view video. The backup is being done in one direction for the most part, with the exception of alarms, so the primary database will send a copy over to the failover database for when it's needed. Looking at our directory services, the primary is running and the backup service is stopped. Now, since we only have one directory running on one server, the clients will connect to the main directory on the server via the main gateway. Now, let's say we have a problem with our primary directory. This means the primary database will not be accessible as well. The DFC on the backup will lose communication with the DFC on the primary server, so we'll start up the directory service on the backup machine. Both clients will lose connection and reconnect with the second server. Since we're now running off the backup directory, we'll be pointing at the backup database as well, even if the primary database is still functional. So, how does the same scenario look in the Security Center side of things? Once again, we have our 2 servers, both of which have been set up for failover and have directory roles installed. And we have our 2 databases as well, either local or on the network. If they are on the network, they'll need to be installed at least as an expansion server. In this example, we'll be using the backup and restore failover method, so the database is being copied from the master database to the backup database. Up top, we've got a couple of clients connecting to the system here as well. And the first main difference you'll see here is that both the directory servers are running and acting as directories, with the first one being the master directory who is in control. Since we have database failover installed, both directories will be connecting to the master database. Our clients will be using a round-robin connection method, so the first client will pick the first server on the list, and the second client will pick the next one on the list. We'll take a look at 2 scenarios here, the first one being the directory server going down. Now, the clients who are connected to this directory will get disconnected and connect to the next directory on the round-robin list, which is our second directory in this case. Okay, so we've fixed the directory and it's back up and running. Now we can consider what happens when the database server goes down. The first thing is that both directories will get disconnected from that database, and they will reconnect to the first backup database over here. This keeps the system up and running with all our directories running to handle the load balancing for the clients. So let's take a look at how the Security Center directory failover system works in a bit more detail, and we'll get into the configuration in a few minutes. As I mentioned, we've got 2 parts to failover in Security Center 5.1, so we're going to break it down and look at the directory and database components separately. Starting with the directory side of things, let's see how the load balancing is handled. We've got our directories here with our primary directory running the directory manager role. The number of directories you should have on the system can be 5 or less, which will be enough to handle things for most systems. All the directories can communicate with each other for synchronization and communication of other information that may be related to other roles. And of course we've got our users up top here, which will be trying to connect to the system. The clients will try to connect to the primary directory, which handles the redirection to the other servers. In the case of the first user, it will take the first server on the list, which is directory 1. User 2 will take the next one on the list, which is directory 2. Now, we can also force a connection which will ignore the round-robin directory list. In our case, we told user 3 to connect only to directory 2, so we'll ignore the next directory on the list and connect there even though user 2 just connected there as well. This will continue for as many users as you have on the system. Now, I just want to mention that this is a very basic form of load balancing, which only looks at the next directory on the list and doesn't check to make sure the connections are divided evenly among the servers. This is the first time we've introduced something like this, so we've kept it to a basic system, but we're looking at improving the load balancing functionality in the future. Moving on and looking at how database failover works, we're going to move the clients out of the picture and only look at our directory servers here. We're going to talk about database failover using the backup and restore method, so we have our databases down here. These can either be installed on the directory servers themselves or on a separate server, but it has to at least be an expansion server. The backups are scheduled through the directory manager and sent to each one of the backup databases on the list. We can have a maximum of 5 directory servers, but we can have more backup databases if we would like. The master database can either send the full backup or it can backup and send only the current updates. These are restored on the backup databases, which stay in a restoring state until they're needed. Let's have a look at this with a detailed example, which will expand on what we saw in the legacy section. This example will have 3 servers set up as failover directories, with directory 1 being our primary, which is running the directory manager role. Let's say each one of these machines has a database server running, and we've got 2 users on the system who are trying to monitor information with the security desk. By default, all our directory servers will be connected to the master database on the first machine. Using our round-robin load balancing functionality, our first user will connect to directory 1, and our second user will connect to directory 2. Let's consider what will happen in a backup and restore situation if the first machine goes down completely. Since the directory and database server are no longer available, the directories will disconnect from the master database, and the first backup database will be chosen as the database to connect to by the remaining directories. Now, one thing I want to note here is that the backups are done from the master database to the failover databases, so even though we have one of the failovers online, the backup process will be stopped until the master comes back online. Now, our user 1 was previously connected to the main directory, so it's going to disconnect and look for the next directory on its list, which is directory 2. So, our friendly neighborhood server technician goes on site and gets our primary machine back up and running. We have an option in the directory manager to automatically reconnect to the master database. If we don't have that enabled, the primary directory will connect to the database that is currently in use as the main database. Now, in the case where the option to reconnect to the master database is checked, all our database servers will disconnect from the database and reconnect to the master database. Since the directory servers will restart the service, the users will get disconnected briefly and may reconnect to a different server. Alright, so now that we've seen what the backup and restore option will do, let's take a look at mirroring. Once again, we have our servers here, but we have a change with respect to the databases. Using SQL mirroring, we have a principal database, a mirror database, and we have a witness server which is used for verification in order to resolve conflicts. The databases can be hosted on any server, and the same is applicable to the witness server here. You'll see in a few minutes that there isn't a lot of configuration to be done within Security Center. The mirroring setup is done through SQL, and there are a lot of resources online from Microsoft that can help you with the actual mirroring configuration. So what happens is the primary database keeps the mirror database up to date, and everyone connects to the principal database. If there's any kind of problem with the principal, SQL will switch over to the mirror database, and the mirror database will update the principal when it comes back online. The whole process is pretty much invisible to the directories and the users. So before we move on to the configuration section, let's just take a brief look at a comparison between the two types of database failover. Both of them fail over automatically and have an unlimited number of entities per system and can support 1,000 clients per directory. When the system fails over to the backup database, there is the possibility of some data loss on the backup and restore mode, as it will only be current up to the last backup that was sent over. Similarly, when the system comes back up to the primary database in backup and restore mode, any changes while in failover mode will be lost unless the secondary database is manually backed up and restored onto the primary. With mirroring, any changes written to one database will be replicated over to the other immediately, so there will be no data loss in either one of these scenarios. Looking at the versions of SQL that can be used, you can use the free Express version for the backup and restore, and for the witness server in mirroring, but the actual mirror databases will need to be running a full version of SQL. Another change is where the database can be running from. Using backup and restore, we need to have the database servers running on either a directory or an expansion server. The mirror databases can be running from any machine since the Genetec software is not handling any of the data replication. The mirror database management is being handled by the witness server, whereas the backup and restore mode uses the directory manager role. Now the last difference is related to the client disconnection down here. Since there is some startup time for the database and the directory server's disconnection and reconnection, the client will disconnect briefly. The time it will take to reconnect is based on how long it takes the directory to connect, plus about a minute of additional overhead. As mentioned previously, mirroring is practically transparent to the clients, and it will not get disconnected from their directories. Alright, so we should have a good handle on how the system behaves in failover mode for Security Center. So let's move on and take a look at the actual configuration. We'll start with the licensing aspect of it and introduce how to add a directory server to the failover list for load balancing. Directory failover is a licensable option, and if you have it enabled, you should see the number of additional directory servers option in the Security Center portion of your license. You can see this from the config tool by going to the home screen and clicking on About to get to the license section. As we mentioned, the number here represents the total number of additional backup servers we have on addition to the main server. If you have this part on your license, you can check the roles section of the system task, and you should see your directory manager role running. The directory manager is the role that manages failover and load balancing in the Security Center system. The role is added automatically and cannot be added manually. If you don't have the role present, take a look at the license first to make sure that part is there when, just like we were looking at in the previous slide. Now, when you first install your system, you'll have your primary directory server and a few expansion servers you want to use as failover directories. You don't need to install anything special or do any licensing on those machines. Everything is handled from the config tool. So the first thing you want to do is add an expansion server to the directory server list. You can do this by hitting the green plus sign on the bottom of the list. And then you can choose the applicable expansion server from the list that comes up here. And you just need to make sure the port number is correct and click on Add. You'll see it show up on the list when once you apply the change, it will ask you to modify your license. This is the step that will set up the expansion servers as directories and push the license information over. Once you modify the license, you have the traditional license activation screen where you can either use the web activation, which is fairly straightforward, or you can do a manual activation, which I'll take a look at here. The first thing to do is save your validation key either to the clipboard or to a file. This is the validation key from the main server, not from one of the expansion servers. Now you'll need to go to the GTAP, expand your directory license, and click on the Download License Key button here. It will ask you why you'd like to download the license key, either because the license was modified or you want to install a failover directory, which is the option we'll choose. You can paste the validation key or browse to the file you saved, and you need to scroll down a little bit and hit the Submit button. Once you get the successful activation screen, save the license file or open it and copy it to the clipboard. Go back to your config tool and paste the new license key or browse to it and hit Activate. The new license will be applied and pushed over to the expansion server, which will restart and come up as a directory server. If there are any changes to the main server's license, you can choose to push the license over to all the servers by using the button on the bottom here. If you need more help with the license activation, we have two places on the GTAP you can look. First is in the tutorial section of the Security Center documents, where you'll find the How to Activate Your Security Center 5.x license through GTAP PDF file. Now we also have a really great GTAP TechTube video in the video section called How to Reactivate Your License when Adding Failover Directory Servers in Security Center 5.1. Okay, so the next thing we need to make sure is set up are the remote connections to the database. If you're going to be setting up directory failover, you'll need to connect to a remote database at some point. If you're only setting up additional directory servers for load balancing and not doing database failover, you'll still need to have the remote connection set up on the master database so other directories can connect to it. When you're using backup and restore mode for database failover, you'll need to set up the remote database connection for the master and backup databases so that any directory can connect to them in a failover condition. Okay, we're going to go over the full steps in a minute, but I just want to briefly do a quick summary of what needs to be done to set up the remote database connection. The first thing we recommend having is a domain user account, which you want to add to the local administrators group on the servers. This is recommended, but in a situation where you don't have a domain set up, you can also bypass this by having the exact same username and password used for all the service accounts, and have this user added to the SQL server as well. Once again, make sure the account being used is a local administrator. This kind of setup is a little more risky, as any change to one of these accounts will need to be manually replicated across the system. We'll need to make sure there is nothing blocking the TCP port that is used for communication, so make sure port 1433 is open in your Windows firewall or other network firewall services. The third step is to open SQL Management Studio Express and enable the remote connection option. After that, we'll need to open the SQL Configuration Manager and make sure the named pipes and TCP/IP protocols are enabled. The SQL Browser service may not be set to start automatically, so we'll need to change the startup properties and start the service. Once these have been set, we'll need to restart both the SQL server and the browser services. The last couple of things we'll have to do are to make sure the account used by the Genetec Service has access to the database, and add this service account to the SQL login page. Alright, so let's go into a little more detail, starting with our first step, which is to make sure remote connections are enabled in SQL. We'll need to go into SQL Server Management Studio to do this, which may be installed with the version of SQL you're using, or you may need to download it. The Express version can be found on the Genetec Technical Assistance portal. Just make sure you're downloading the version that matches the version of SQL that you're using. In the GTAP, you can find the software in the Tools section under Utilities, and it's part of the Windows Components category. Now, when you open SQL Management Studio, it will ask you to log in, and you can just use the Windows authentication, which should be the default. Once you're in there, you'll see your server start up on the top of the server on the top of the tree here. And we'll want to right-click on it and go to the properties. From there, you can click on the connections. And on the right, make sure we have allow remote connections checked right here. You can leave that open for now, but we need to make sure the protocols are enabled by going into the SQL Configuration Manager. And you won't need to download this, it should have been installed with SQL regardless of the version. From the Configuration Manager, expand the SQL Server Network configuration and click on the section called Protocols for and your database name, and in our case it's SQL Express. You'll see two protocols on the right that we need to have enabled, named pipes and TCP/IP. You can double click on them and set them to enabled if they are disabled at the moment. Now that's all we need to do in the Configuration Manager, so we can close that now, and we're going to switch over to the Windows services. An easy way to bring this up is to click on your Start button, click on Run or the box to search programs, and type services.msc. From the Windows services, go down to the one called SQL Server Browser, right-click on it, and go to the Properties. We need to set the startup type to automatic, and then once that's set, we can click on Start. Close the properties, and we'll need to restart the SQL services next. Right-click on the SQL Server and SQL Server Browser and choose the Restart option. If you just started the SQL Server Browser, you can just do the SQL Server instead. Alright, now we need to use the domain user account that we had mentioned. We're still in the Windows services, and we're going to need to right-click on the Genetec Server service and go into the Properties. In the Logon section, make sure we're logging in with the specific account and not the local system account. So not this option here, we want to specify this one right here. Put in the domain user account and password, and then just hit apply or OK to accept the changes. We're going to need to make sure we do this for any server that is running a Genetec server service, even if it's an expansion server that is not being used as part of the directory failover system. We need to use an account that can access the SQL Server instance, which in our case will be our domain user. The last step is to make sure the domain user account has the right privileges in our SQL server. So let's go back to our SQL Server Management Studio that we had open, expand the security section of the database, and then expand logins here. If our domain user is not listed here, right-click on the logins and select New Login. Put in the login name, including the domain, and you can keep it set to use the Windows authentication. Once you have that set in the General page, you can switch to the Server Roles page right here, and you'll need to make sure the sysadmin role is checked. This is pretty important, or you won't have the proper privileges to read and write to the database. And once you have that set up, you're good to go for your database configuration. Just make sure you've taken care of all this on all the database servers you'll be using. Okay, so now we have our databases set up. Let's take a look at what we need to do to configure load balancing. The first step is to add as many servers as you'll be using, up to 5 or the limit of your license. We've already covered that in the licensing section, so I won't go over that aspect of it again. Now, when we're looking at the server list, all the servers there are directory servers, but only one of them is currently the main server. The main server has a globe icon on the server icon, such as next to our support webinar server here. And this one is the only directory that has read and write access to the master database, which holds the system configuration. The other directory servers in the list only have read access to the database and must go through the main directory to make any changes. If we want to manually change which one is the main server, you just need to select the directory from the Directory Server section and hit the Activate button from the bottom of the page. You'll get a warning that the current directory will restart, and you'll just need to hit Continue on that warning and click on Apply to keep the change. Since the directory is restarting, you'll get some application and role disconnection for a few minutes. Now, if you take a look at the bottom of the server list, you'll have an option to force the first server on the list to be the main server. If you want to activate another server as the main server, you'll need to make sure this option is unchecked. You can also change the order of the directory servers using the arrows on the right side of the list. Just select a server and hit the up or down arrow to bump it up or down in the list, and make sure we hit apply to force the changes to take effect. We're going to take a look at the server admin for a minute to look at the database configuration there. By default, the database server that is configured usually uses a local system. So in our case, we started out with local/omnicast. You'll probably have to change this to the name of the directory server, to the name of the server / name of the database. The server name may need to be added to your host file in Windows or on any machines using it as well. Now when we go into database failover, if we go into a failover state, you may notice that the database name does not change and is still pointing to what was our master database. This is completely normal, as the database or the directory manager is in charge of designating which database will be used at that point, and you don't need to modify anything in the server admin. One last thing to talk about in the configuration concerns the load balancing. As we mentioned, load balancing is used to redirect clients to other directories using a round-robin distribution method. The list of directory is pushed to each client, and this list is saved locally. When a client is trying to connect to the main server, it may be redirected to a different server on the list. When this happens, you'll see a notification message like the one on our login screen here. We can locally manage this redirection on the client applications and force them to connect to only one directory and not get redirected as well. This can be found in the options section from the home menu of the client applications. So if you have your client on a remote LAN, for instance, you may not want them to be redirected to another directory, which may eat up more bandwidth. In the general options, under the user login section here, you can force the application to connect to a certain directory server by checking this here and putting the name of the directory server. And just below it, you can also check the option to prevent the client from being redirected to other directory servers. Now I just want to give you a heads up here. If you set the force connection to option right here and make a typo in the directory name, it'll get stuck trying to connect to the server. You'll have to go into the configuration files manually to clear this out, or you can contact the Genetec Technical Assistance Center and we can take a look into that for you. We're going to move on to the configuration for the database failover, starting with the backup and restore mode. Now, in order to use the database failover, you have to switch the option to on in the database failover list here. You can use the directory failover option just for load balancing without having the database failover option enabled if you would like. Below that, we have our two modes, backup and restore, and mirroring. So the first thing we'll want to do is add a database server. You'll need to select the server the database is on, the database server itself, the database name, and the restore folder to use. The database instances must all be the same version of SQL, and as we mentioned, have to be on the same Security Center servers, so either an expansion or directory server, and the database has to be accessible from all the directory servers. Once we hit OK there, we will see our server added to the list here. Now if we take a look at the lower portion of the tab, we have a few options with regards to the backups that are made and restored. First, we want to set the frequency of the full backup that is done from the master database. Next to how often, you can specify what time it will run at, and have a button to force a full backup to be done right now. Below that, we can set how often to do the differential backup, which is the partial backup that is sent over and merged with the last full backup. This can be done anywhere between 15 minutes and 1 day, but remember that there will be some network overhead for this. Now, when you do a full backup, it will delete the last full backup and any differential backup files that are there. But when a main database comes back up after being in a failover state, the secondary databases will be stored in the contingency backups folder and are not automatically deleted. One last point that is optional is to enable the automatic reconnection to the master database when it comes back online. Now this will happen if the database actually fails, but if you have a network problem, it will not fail back and give you a chance to back up the current database and restore it to the master if needed. Alright, now I want to touch on something here that really quick, and it's pretty important. If you make any changes to your master database from the server admin after setting up failover, you need to make sure you generate a full backup from the directory manager role. So for example, we would need to do this if we restored a previous backup of the directory database from the server admin. If we don't generate the full backup, the master and backup databases will be out of sync and the database failover mechanism won't work. So once everything has been set up, you'll see your database servers in there in a ready state, as we see right here, and once the backup completes, you'll see a backup and restore time in here as well. So just to give a brief summary of how backup and restore mode works, you have one master database and any number of backup database servers. This is a lower cost solution than mirroring since you can use the free SQL Server Express edition. It works well for multi-site installations if you have a high bandwidth connection between the sites. And when it's working under normal conditions, all the directories are connected to the master database. The main directory has read and write control, and the other directories work in read-only mode. The full and partial backups are made from the master database and restored to the backup databases on a set schedule. Now, there's a few limitations I'd like to mention as well. Now, when you hit a failover condition, the backup database is only up to date as of the last backup that was done. So, if your last backup was 45 minutes ago and you made a change 15 minutes before the system failed over, that change won't be reflected in your backup database. When the database fails back to the master database, any changes that were done in failover mode are not kept. The only database that does backups is the master database, so when you're in failover mode, the database backup function is disabled. The data loss you might see in a failover event would be related to what you're recording to the directory database, so you might see some configuration changes, alarms, audit trails, and other data that was not copied over to the backup database before the system failed over. We're going to take a look at the database mirroring configuration now, which is pretty simple on the Genetec side of things. As you can see from the options, there's not much to set up for mirroring. Basically everything is being set up in the SQL Server configuration. The failover itself is handled by the SQL Server as well, so nothing is being done by Security Center. The principal and mirror database instances are being kept in sync by SQL at all times, so you won't see any data loss if a failover occurs. All we really need to set up here is the mirror database, right down here. One thing to note is that the two databases must be the same version, and if you're using an instance name for the database server instead of the server itself, the two instance names have to be different. Now, if you have any trouble setting up mirroring on the SQL side, take a look at the Microsoft documentation or have a look online on the Microsoft TechNet. So just to take a look at a couple of the main features and advantages of using mirroring, the main thing to point out is that this is the best option to use if you have a system where you cannot tolerate any data loss in a failover situation. Another nice thing is that the directory server doesn't restart and disconnect, so basically the clients are always connected when the failover occurs. As we mentioned, there is instant synchronization between the servers, so any changes are written to both databases right away, and will prevent any data loss due to the backup delay. The SQL mirroring uses a witness server, which stops and starts the SQL servers based on the situation and what is needed. It uses a quorum to make sure the data replication is kept up to date between the two. Now, of course, there are some limitations when using SQL mirroring. It is a more expensive solution since you're not able to use the free version of SQL and need to purchase a standard SQL license. This also doesn't replace clustering, so the other roles are on their own with respect to database usage, and it's only working for the directory database. If you need a reliable system for keeping both servers up and running for all roles, then clustering may be the way to go if the budget allows it. With regards to the databases in use by other roles, we can't use mirroring as a failover method for these roles as well. Now, one last disadvantage of using mirroring is it's not recommended to have the databases on different sites. If there's a communication breakdown between the sites, your failover won't function properly and you may be left with no database at all. In this kind of situation, it would be preferable to use the backup and restore database failover method. Okay, so I'd like to take a few minutes just to point out some of the best practices that we recommend doing when you're setting up a failover directory system. The first is to use a domain user to run the Genetec Services and have added to the SQL databases. If you set up individual workgroup accounts and change the password on one of them, this will cause accessibility problems in the system. When looking at the type of network, the directory failover system was really designed to work best on a local LAN with a large network bandwidth. Due to the overhead, it's not recommended to go over 5 directory servers for load balancing. If you feel you need more than that, there may be some other design that would work better, such as using federation. For the database servers, the best thing to do would be to have these installed on different servers other than the directory. This way, if there's a hardware problem on the machine, it won't take down both the directory and the database at the same time. We touched on this briefly, but it would also be a good idea to put the roles on other servers than the directory if you have the capacity to do so. The directory manager is set up to handle the failover of the directory role, but the other roles will need to have their own failover set up if available. So let's take a look at this in a small setup where we have our 2 servers set up using backup and restore database failover. The first server has the directory manager role, the archiver, the media router, and the access manager role running here. In a failover situation, the clients will briefly disconnect and reconnect to directory 2. And if we set up the second server as a failover server for the other roles, they will move over to run on this server as well, with the exception of the access manager, as it does not have the ability to fail over to another server. Now we're going to consider what happens if we're using only one database server for both the master and backup databases, or we're not doing database failover. Basically, if something happens to the server that is running the database, we're going to be in trouble since none of the directories will have a database to refer to, and failover will not function. We don't recommend having a configuration like this, and an extra database server should be available on another physical machine in order for failover to function properly. Alright, so let's take a look at some brief troubleshooting steps that you can use for 3 of our most common problems. The first common issue we've seen is where there's no communication between the servers and the remote databases. The number one suspect in this case is the Windows firewall or some other firewall service. We'll need to make sure we have TCP port 1433 open. If you want to test this, you can shut down the firewall completely, but we don't recommend leaving it this way. Unblocking the ports is preferable and should be done on the Windows firewall and anywhere else you have a firewall running, such as on a router. Another cause of this kind of problem is the SQL connection configuration. In particular, take a look to make sure the remote connection option has been allowed for the database server. All the settings we went over for the remote connection section are important, and it would be a good idea to double check those to make sure everything was saved and applied. Now, after checking the settings, go into the server admin and verify the database server path. We shouldn't be using local in the path, like we have in our example here. It needs to be specified to the name of the server and using a network path that's accessible by all servers. Finally, if we're having connection problems, it might be a permission issue. We need to make sure the Genetec Services are running under a domain account or everything is using the same username and password in a work group. The second troubleshooting situation we see a lot is where we can't add a database to the directory failover list and the drop-down box is empty. Now, when we're using backup and restore, the Genetec server service is required for communication and to assist with the backup management. If you don't see anything in the list, the server was probably not installed on that machine, and it needs to at least be installed on an expansion server. Now, the third scenario is where you're getting errors on the backup or is not working in general. The problem may be that when the backup and restore method was set up, a full backup was not initiated after the servers were configured. We need to do the full backup to push a good full configuration over to the backup servers in order for the incremental backups to go over. The other possible cause of the issue is that the folder specified as the backup folder is not accessible by Security Center. You need to make sure the service used by the Genetec server has read and write access to that folder. Now, I want to go back to something I mentioned previously, where you have the automatically reconnect option selected, but the directory manager is not setting the master database back to the active database. Now, you might see this if the master database went down and we're running on the backup, and this behavior is actually normal. What's happening is the system recognizes the fact that the database it is currently running on may be more current than the master that just came back online. In essence, it's giving you a chance to back up the current database and restore it to the master so you won't lose any data when it switches back over. Now, you won't see this in a network outage because the system knows the database was still active the whole time and has the current configuration. There are a few places you can look for more information on what is happening on the system, starting with the system status. There are a few places to look to see this information. The first is in the top corner of the screen to see if you have any health warnings, like the 3 that we have here. Or any health errors as well, like we have in our example with the red cross here. You can check the status of the role by running a system status task and choosing roles from the monitor drop-down menu. From here you can see which server the roles are running on and the servers that we have set up. You can also run an Audit Trails task and see if any changes were made to the Directory Manager role in case it was working and something changed in the Security Center configuration. The last place to look is the Health History task, where you can specify the source of the health problem and the severity, as well as a time range if needed. Now, this is a good way to check when you've had a database problem if you see health events like the main database lost event that we have up here. Alright, so that does it for the troubleshooting portion, and now we're going to bring Mike in and we're going to go over a few of the questions you've been asking during the webinar. Hey Mike, how are you?
Not too bad.
Good, good. Okay, so the first question that we were asked, so how does the client get the failover list from the directory manager if the failover list runs on the server?
So basically the list is stored on the directories, and as soon as the client connects, he'll actually get that list and it will be cached on the client himself. So if ever the directory goes off, he can connect to the next one in his list and resume connections. And this connection list is the one that you have configured in the directory tab where you do your load balancing on your servers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and to set up our round robin list, will the directory manager have to push it down to the client, or do you have to add that manually?
No, everything is done automatically. So basically from the list that you had configured in the Security Center, it will get pushed out, same thing to the client, and he'll get that list of servers in there. So no manual intervention is needed.
Okay, thank you. Our third question, do you know the failover timeout value and how long it waits before failing over?
It's around 1 minute so that the services can confirm that they're down. So any network disruptions that you would get past a certain amount of time will trigger the failover. But usually you see a delay of about a minute before the failover actually starts taking process.
Okay. And now our fourth question. Now, if I force the directory name but type it in incorrectly or the name changes, how do I change the login info if I can't get logged in?
So basically, if there was an error that was made either in the list or typing it manually, you can hold the Control-Shift key while logging on, and it will open all your windows, and you'll be then able to modify the directory name or enter an IP address and modify the credentials.
Cool, thank you. All right, our fifth question. In our example license, why are the number of active directories different than the failover directories?
Well, basically, the active directories are the ones that are doing the load balancing. So you can have up to 5 of these servers that will handle client requests, and the failover directories basically are the database guys. Those are the ones that you can configure, and you can have multiple. You can have maybe more than 5, if need be, of database failovers. So both of them handle different. One is client connections, which is the failover directories, and the other one is databases. So you can have different servers just hosting databases to failover to.
So they're really two separate tiers, two separate numbers there.
Correct. They're independent from each other. So we can have multiple databases that are not the same as the directory servers.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So I think that pretty much answers our questions here, and that'll do it for the question section. And I'd like to thank Mike for his help.
Yeah, thank you, Derek.
No problem. So we're going to be keeping the webinar session active for another 10 minutes or so in case you have any other remaining questions. The video of the webinar will be posted on the Genetec Technical Assistance portal within the next couple of days. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to post them on the GTAP forums under the GTAC Tech Talk section. Any comments, feedback, or suggestions for future webinars are always appreciated, so please leave those on the GTAP forums as well. On behalf of myself and everyone at the Genetec Technical Assistance Center, I'd like to thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and we hope you all have a very good day.